Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to try to answer a question I know a lot of you have been wondering about. How do large language models, things like ChatGPT, how do they actually store all the information they seem to know? You guys sent in this really awesome 3 blue, 1 brown video, and I'm pretty excited to dig into it.
Yeah, it's easy to kind of just take it for granted how these models can just like pull up all these facts on demand, but the mechanism behind it is still pretty mind-blowing.
Absolutely. So let's set ourselves a little bit of a challenge here. The video uses this example. Michael Jordan plays basketball. Pretty basic. But our goal today is to try and figure out how an LLM might actually store that fact, that simple fact, in its digital brain.
Yeah, and it's not like LLMs have like, little file folders for each fact.
Right.
To understand how they do it, we kind of have to like start thinking differently about how like information is represented. The first key is understanding that LLMs, they break down text into these like smaller chunks called tokens. And you can think of them like words or, even parts of words.
Okay.
Then each token is transformed into something called a vector.
Okay, a vector. Is that kind of like a direction on a map?
Yeah, sort of. So you can imagine a map, but instead of just like, north, south, east, west, you got thousands of potential directions, right? And each word or token gets plotted as like a point in this huge multidimensional space.
Okay.
And the really cool thing is the location of a word. It isn't random. It's all about relationships.
So words that are similar in meaning, they'd be kind of clustered closer together in this space.
Exactly. The video gives a super cool example. So, think about the vectors for woman, man, and uncle. If you subtract the man vector from the woman vector, you get a direction. And that direction, it basically represents the concept of gender. Then, if you add that to the uncle vector, you end up near the vector for aunt.
Well, wait, so just by like moving around in this space, like using vector math, you can actually encode meaning in relationships? That's crazy.
Yeah.
But LLMs go beyond single words, right? They're not.
Oh, they totally do.
Yeah.
Yeah, these vectors, they become even more powerful because they evolve to represent not just individual words, but like the context that they appear in and like the knowledge that the model has learned, right? And so this is where things start getting like really interesting, because the question is, where does this factual knowledge actually reside within the model?
All right, so we've got these like, meaning-packed vectors kind of swirling around in this space. What's actually processing them and, potentially like storing these facts?
So the video points to these things called multi-layer perceptrons, or, MLPs for short, as like a key suspect. And these MLPs they're a crucial part of what's called the transformer architecture, which powers LLMs.
Okay, MLPs, transformers. Break it down for me a little bit. What exactly is an MLP doing in this whole Michael Jordan plays basketball situation?
Okay, so imagine this. You've got vectors for Michael, Jordan, and basketball all kind of like hanging out in this high-dimensional space, right?
Right.
The MLP, it takes the Michael Jordan vector as an input, and through like a series of mathematical steps, tries to like connect it with the basketball vector.
Like
a little machine for building these associations.
So walk me through what's happening inside the MLP. Like, what are these mathematical steps? What's going on?
Okay, so the first step is called up projection. Think of it like putting our Michael Jordan vector through a series of like tests.
Tests, okay.
The MLP multiplies this vector by a huge matrix. It's like a grid of numbers.
Yeah.
And each row in this matrix is kind of like asking a question about the features of that vector.
Features like, is it a person? Is it a sport? That kind of thing.
Exactly. Then what's called a bias is added, and it's basically like another set of learned parameters, and then the results are run through what's called a re-LU function.
Re-LU. Okay, now we're getting into some of the alphabet soup here.
Don't worry. Re-LU is actually pretty simple. You can imagine it like a gatekeeper that only lets positive values pass through.
Okay.
Anything negative just gets turned into a 0.
So it's like filtering out any kind of irrelevant or negative signals?
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. Now, this whole like up projection process, it expands our vector into an even higher dimensional space, which allows for like way more complex calculations.
Okay, so the vector has been questioned, it's been tweaked. It's now in this bigger, even bigger space.
Yeah.
What happens next?
Next comes what's called the down projection. This step takes that expanded vector and it multiplies it by another matrix. But this time you can kind of imagine each column in this matrix represents a direction in our vector space, including that basketball direction that we're interested in.
Mm-hmm. So the multiplication figures out which directions to kind of add to the vector based on the answers to those initial, like, questions from the up projection.
Exactly. Another bias is added, and then this final output, it's added back to the original Michael Jordan vector. And ideally, if the MLP is doing its job right, the output vector, it'll now also point strongly in the direction of basketball, basically encoding that factual association.
Okay, so let me try to visualize this. The Michael Jordan vector enters the MLP, it gets like quizzed, filtered, and then like projected into this massive space. Then through this like down projection magic, the basketball direction gets added to it, and boom, the MLP has potentially stored that fact.
That's the idea. And to make things even more impressive, GPT-3, one of the biggest LLMs out there, it has 96 of these MLP blocks.
96.
Each with about 1.2 billion parameters.
Wow.
That's a lot of potential for storing and processing information.
Wow. 96 blocks, each with over 1 billion parameters. That's mind-boggling. But if it's really this straightforward, like, wouldn't we be able to just, like, find specific neurons in these MLPs that just light up? Like, whenever Michael Jordan is mentioned, like neuron 325, the Michael Jordan neuron.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it leads us to, like, an even deeper mystery. Researchers haven't really found evidence of such, like, simple one-to-one mappings.
Wow.
It seems like things are a bit more complex than that.
So how is it possible that all this information is getting stored if we can't, like, isolate individual features? Like, what are we missing?
Well, remember how we were talking about words being represented as vectors in a high-dimensional space?
Right.
There's this really fascinating concept called superposition that might hold the key to understanding how so much information can be packed into these models.
Superposition. I feel like I've heard that word before, but I can't quite place it.
It's actually a concept from quantum physics, but it applies surprisingly well here. It has to do with, like, how many vectors you can actually fit into our high-dimensional space.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this whole superposition idea and how it relates to LLMs.
So imagine you're trying to fit as many lines as you can into a space, right? If they all have to be perfectly perpendicular, like north, south, east, west, you're kind of limited by, like, the number of dimensions you have.
Right, so in a 3D space, you could only fit 3 lines that are all at right angles to each other.
Exactly. But what if you, like, relax that rule a little bit? Like, instead of demanding perfect right angles, you just, allowed the lines to be almost perpendicular, slightly off.
Interesting. So they're still mostly independent, but not totally.
Precisely. And here's the really cool thing. By allowing just this, like, slight flexibility, you can fit exponentially more lines into that same space.
Wow.
The video, it actually shows this really neat simulation where they pack in, like, thousands of vectors into a 100-dimensional space just by making them, nearly but not perfectly perpendicular.
So are you saying that these MLPs might be using this whole superposition trick to store way more information than like the number of neurons would suggest?
Yeah, that's a leading theory. It could explain why LLMs get so much better as they get bigger, right? Like, adding more dimensions to that vector space lets them store exponentially more information using the superposition principle. It's like they're squeezing in extra knowledge by just, like, slightly tilting those vectors.
Wow, that's a pretty elegant solution. But it also makes it even harder to picture what's actually going on in there. If these neurons aren't representing, like, simple features, how on earth do we figure out how all this knowledge is, like, organized and accessed? It's like trying to read a book that's written in a language we just don't understand.
Yeah, and you're hitting on a really crucial challenge in AI research right now. The problem of interpretability.
Right.
Just because an LLM can, like, spit out the right answer, it doesn't mean that we actually understand how it arrived at that answer.
Right.
And that's where tools like sparse autoencoders come into play.
Sparse autoencoders. We touched on these in the outline. Remind me what those are all about.
So you can think of them as like a special kind of decoder ring for LLMs. They're neural networks themselves, but, like, instead of generating text, they're designed to actually analyze and interpret the inner workings of other neural networks.
So they're like AI detectives trying to crack the case of how LLMs store and process information.
Yeah, exactly. They work by trying to, like, compress the information from a layer of neurons, the output of that up projection step in the MLP, into a smaller, more manageable representation.
And the sparse part means they try to do this using as few neurons as possible.
Precisely. By forcing the autoencoder to be sparse, meaning that only a small number of neurons are actually active at any given time, researchers are hoping to, like, isolate the most crucial features that are actually contributing to the model's knowledge.
So it's like sifting through a giant haystack to find the few needles that are actually like holding the whole thing together.
That's a great analogy. If most neurons are silent, the ones that are firing, they must be representing something really important, right? And the hope is that these active neurons, they correspond to those nearly perpendicular directions in that high dimensional space, each potentially encoding, a much more complex feature than just a single word or concept.
So by analyzing what these sparse autoencoders are kind of latching onto, we might actually get a glimpse into how the LLM is actually like organizing information internally.
Yeah.
It's like peeking behind the curtain to see the wizard's machinery.
It's definitely a really cutting edge area of research.
Yeah.
And it's still early days, but sparse autoencoders offer a really promising way to kind of, shed light on these incredibly complex systems.
This whole discussion has really highlighted just how different LLMs are from how we think. It's not just about like memorizing facts like a giant database or something.
Right.
It's about building these incredibly intricate representations of knowledge that are based on like relationships and patterns in the data they've been trained on.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost beautiful in a way.
It really is quite remarkable. But this complexity also brings, some challenges. If we don't fully understand how these models are arriving at their conclusions, how can we be sure they're not picking up biases or inaccuracies from the data they've been trained on?
That's a really good point. It seems like, the more powerful these models become, the more important it is to actually develop tools and techniques to understand them better.
Absolutely. It's not just about satisfying our curiosity, right? It's about ensuring that these models are used responsibly and ethically.
So let's bring it back to our listener and their original question about Michael Jordan plays basketball. Right. We've gone on quite a journey here from tokens and vectors to MLPs and sparse autoencoders. What would you say is like the key takeaway about how that fact might actually be stored in an LLM?
I don't think there's a simple answer, but we have gained some really valuable insights. Or we can't just like point to a specific neuron or line of code that says Michael Jordan plays basketball. Instead, it's likely a combination of all these incredibly intricate mechanisms that we've been talking about, vector representations, these complex computations within those MLPs, and potentially even, this mind-bending concept of superposition. It's it's like a symphony of mathematical operations all working together to create this illusion of knowledge.
Okay, I'm starting to get the picture here. We've gone from what seemed like a pretty simple question to this like incredibly complex and nuanced understanding of how LLMs operate. It's amazing to think about like the vastness of that high dimensional space where all this information is encoded. But this journey has also raised some big questions for me.
Yeah.
If individual neurons aren't actually representing like simple features, what does that mean for our ability to truly understand and control what these models learn and how they reason?
Yeah, that's a really crucial question, and it's one that researchers are really grappling with right now. It's a really exciting time to be in this field.
I have a feeling this is just the beginning of our exploration into the world of LLMs. Mm-hmm. There's so much more to uncover, and I'm eager to keep diving deeper. But I think this is a perfect place to kind of pause for now. We've covered a lot of ground, and I'm sure our listeners could use a moment to let all this kind of sink in. Welcome back to the Deep Dive.
I don't know about you, but my brain is still kind of like processing everything we just talked about, all this stuff about how LLMs might store facts. It really got me thinking, like, what does it even mean for an LLM to know something? It's not like they're learning and understanding things in the same way that we do, are they?
That's a really great point, and it gets to like the heart of what makes these models so fascinating, right? They don't know things in the way that we typically think about knowledge. They don't have beliefs or experiences or consciousness.
Yeah.
So it's more about like recognizing patterns and relationships in like this massive amount of data that they've been trained on, right? They can predict what words are likely to come next, but that doesn't mean they're actually like grasping the meaning behind those words.
Exactly. Like going back to our Michael Jordan example, right? An LLM can correctly fill in the blank in Michael Jordan plays based on, statistical associations in the data.
Right.
It's like a super powered autocomplete.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that the model actually understands who Michael Jordan is or what the sport of basketball even is.
It's like, those image recognition AIs that can identify a cat in a picture, but then they get totally fooled by like these subtle changes that a human wouldn't even notice. The AI is recognizing patterns, but it's not really seeing the cat in the same way that we do.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. It really highlights the difference between, pattern recognition and genuine understanding. And that distinction it's really crucial when we think about the capabilities and limitations of these models. We can't just assume that they're thinking or comprehending the world like humans do.
So as LLMs get, more and more powerful, it's important that we don't get carried away and overestimate their intelligence.
Right.
We need to remember that there's incredibly sophisticated tools, but they're still, they're still tools.
Absolutely. It's a call for critical thinking and healthy skepticism.
Right.
We need to be aware of the potential for, biases and inaccuracies and even, the possibility of the model just, completely making stuff up, right?
Yeah.
They can be incredibly convincing, but we shouldn't forget that they're ultimately statistical machines.
Right.
Not sentient beings.
Well, this deep dive has really opened my eyes to the complexities of LLMs. We've journeyed through tokens and vectors. We've explored this intricate world of MLPs, and we even touched on this mind-bending concept of superposition.
Yeah.
It's been quite a ride.
It really has been a fascinating exploration, and it just highlights how much we're still learning about these really powerful tools.
Before we wrap up, let's leave our listener with some food for thought here. What's the one thing you'd want them to really remember from this whole deep dive?
I think the biggest takeaway is that, LLMs represent a fundamentally different way of processing and generating information, right? It's not about memorizing facts. It's about creating these intricate high-dimensional representations of knowledge based on patterns and relationships in data.
Yeah.
They're powerful tools with incredible potential, but understanding their limitations is crucial as we integrate them into our lives.
That's a great point to end on. And remember, we've only scratched the surface here.
Sure.
If you're eager to learn more, we've included links to the 3 Blue 1 Brown video and some other resources in the show notes.
And who knows, maybe this deep dive will inspire you to go and explore this fascinating field even further.
That's it for this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey into the world of LLMs.